Hi, everyone. This is Jackson Steger, and you're listening to Season 2 of Campfire. Let's get it. This season of Campfire seeks to understand how to build new cities. Each week, we are joined by experts and practitioners from different startup cities who will share the stories and lessons that they have learned from experimenting with radical new models of living. Cabin is building its own network city of co-living neighborhoods. Our first location outside of Austin, Texas, has one more spot left for November, and we'll open up our other neighborhoods for co-living soon. If you're interested in long-term co-living at beautiful locations with nature out the front door, high-speed internet, actual campfires, and unlimited sauna use, you can join the waitlist today by visiting cabin.city. Also, let us know if there's a guest that you think we should have on this show. If you introduce us to a city builder and we book them, we'll reward you with Cabin's token. Today's guest is Angelo Alessio, founder and CEO of Build Cities. Build Cities is a protocol for network states. We've touched on network states a little bit in the past, and if this is a completely new term for you, I recommend visiting thenetworkstate.com. But I'll provide a simple definition, which is that a network state is the sequel to the nation state. It's a possible kind of future country that starts as an online community and eventually crowdfunds land that provides goods and services. Angelo's thesis at Build Cities is that these aspiring network states, kind of like Cabin, will need certain tools and digital infrastructure in order to prosper and grow. So in this episode, we'll talk about the roadmap for his product, which is brand new. It just launched last Thursday, and we riff on network states. All right, time to dive in. Let's get it. Well, Angelo Alessio, welcome to Campfire.
Jackson, thanks for having me. Really appreciate being on the show. Thanks again.
So listeners just should know that I am currently recording this from Cabin's Neighborhood Zero, where we are currently building a bathhouse as we continue to add more bedrooms and more living space to the property. So if you hear any hammering or concrete saws during this episode, that's why. Angelo, I just want to start before we get into Build and all the awesome stuff you're doing with Build Cities and Build Republic. Want to just get a sense of you and what interests you in city building. What's like the common thread that ties your career together, and what is it about new cities and network states and this whole space that we're in that attracts you?
Yeah, sure. And again, I actually hope we hear jackhammers and stuff in the background. I feel like that's the perfect permanent kind of background noise for a podcast like this or anything in this space. So, common thread. So, little about me. I was born and raised in San Diego. I was in the Army for 4 years and then moved to New York about 6 years ago. And I think the kind of probably common thread that's kind of has emerged is that I have probably a borderline kind of ADD breadth of interest in just like too many topics. And when I moved to New York, I realized like I don't even know what a startup was, right? But right away, I think I kind of found a calling there because I think it was just fascinating that you could take any given interest in the world and somebody out there is building a business off of it. So I think that kind of really kind of satiated my kind of just intellectual curiosity about all these different things that are out there. And then the second kind of theme I've noticed is that I think I do best making decisions off of incomplete data, which is learned a lot about that from really the Army and even times before that. And then it translated very nicely to startups as well. I think that's just the name of the game. It's like, hey, we have to execute in one direction or the other. And, we're getting more data points along the way to kind of figure out what that path looks like. So I think that's the common thread that really led me into just being in startups. So worked at a YC startup as a product manager for a HR tech company that was basically doing paperless it's kind of like LinkedIn for hospitality workers. So making it so they didn't have to fill out like 20 paper applications just to get, a single place. So that was cool. And then the second startup was Techstars ones. I've kind of seen both ecosystems there. Was first hire leading product and growth we built an AI chatbot to automatically negotiate bank fees and interest charges. So things like overdrafts, insufficient funds. We literally just built a bot that automatically negotiated with banks to get that money back. We did ended up scaling that from 0 to like over 6 million in refunds. We got acquired by kind of a larger neobank February of last year. and that was a great kind of foray into startups. So like as far as career wise, like this is definitely the trajectory set I've kind of been on. And then, what led me to build today. So we actually literally just launched our first kind of product just yesterday, actually, or publicly at least. And that was about 14 months after I wrote this kind of white paper kind of vision, which I think was kind of the bat signal to bring in people and what is now our current founding team and contributors um, to bring this thing to life. So it was just really cool to see that all come to life. And I think one, if I had to kind of say like maybe like a third theme is like I'm very kind of gravitate mainly to startups that have some kind of positive externality. So both the HR tech one and the fintech one I thought was a good mission to get behind. And I see some of the same things, or at least motivated by a lot of the same kind of externalities. And namely the main one being kind of this, basically like level playing field of talent and capital that can go to cities around the world, so that anybody can kind of create and build new startups, basically. So kind of the if innovation's kind of been moving away from Silicon Valley to places like Austin and Miami and New York, I'm kind of thinking like, hey, let's break that open further. Like, let's go. Our co-founders in Coeur d'Alene. We've got a kind of some activity in Victoria, Texas, Lagos, Nigeria. Like we're seeing this activity form now, and it's just really invigorating.
Yeah, I think that having the HR background from the talent side, and then like because cities are nothing without their people, and then also having the fintech background, like a city thrives when it has a thriving economy. So I feel like those are two really important components to inform any protocol building for a city. Cool. So then
I
to
hope
that
so.
end, like, well, I want to ask about like what Build is, but before I do that, like we haven't really talked about the network state, Balaji's book, too much on this show yet, and we will over time. But would love just to get a sense of like to you and in your own words, what is the network state? Recognizing that we haven't talked about it with the audience too much, and also why do you think we need new countries or new cities?
Yeah. So great question. So I'm going to default out of no. I'm going to default to the kind of the default network state definition that Balaji outlines in the book. I know it's kind of a long one. I can't reverberate it exactly word for word, but outside of no kind of uh, original differentiation from there, I'll just kind of default to that one as the table stakes. And then I guess why I think why we need new countries on this particular question. I just think the main thing is less maybe about like the country per se and like the connotation of everything that carries, like sovereignty, the ability to exercise sovereignty and whatnot, and more just about like the prerequisite to that is just completely new border lines. So like I was just realizing today that like new border lines are kind of being drawn by multi-sigs, right? So like DAO members who, in different spots around the world, like that's kind of their borderline of that DAO, so to speak. And it's like, we're now able to distribute, capital and basically subsidize innovation in places all around the world in which that economic benefit can tie to different places that had no relationship whatsoever beforehand, right? Like, and I think that just kind of really just first of all just raises a question that I think a lot of people are still answering and thinking about and talking about is like, what is a country, first of all, right? Like, what do the borderlines represent? Where do they stop? Where do they, like I think that's kind of the primary I don't want to use the word disruption, but just kind of like, yeah, I mean, literally just question that now arises because of, I think, a large part of it being, to this new technology that we're all, kind of working in, or industry, or yeah.
Yeah, I feel like for me, I was thinking on this question yesterday, right? And like I love the States, and I certainly am not trying to like abandon my US
Yeah.
citizenship. But like I think a lot of countries, not just ours, are really divided, and they struggle to make everyone happy. We have different news sources. We live in echo chambers, dwindling trust in institutions, and just like democratic ideals of like in the U.S. the founding fathers had, and other Western constitution-based societies, like these ideals that they held in such high esteem, just because of 1,000 different factors, aren't necessarily being met all the time. And yet, like despite all of that, like one of my core beliefs is that we have way more in common than not. We all love to eat and laugh and play games, and I think what Balaji writes to is just like this idea that you can have these highly aligned online communities that start as cloud first and are land last. And like, it's just very exciting to imagine a world where me and 10,000 or 100,000 or a million others like me want to build like a world like that's bonded by the same set of values, which like at Cabin is to co-live with awesome, thoughtful people. It's to create cool stuff. It's to conserve nature. And I think just fresh starts inspire us generally to build something amazing and better and not bound by historical constraints. And so like with that as context, would love for you to just understand like what is build, and is it build protocol? Is it build citizenry? Is it build republic? Like, how do you think about
Sure.
like what build is? And then who is build protocol for?
Yeah, great question, and just to caveat on everything you're mentioning, I think, testament to all the work that Cabin DAO has done, City DAO, Kift, all these cool projects. I think we've already like you're 100% right in that, like we're seeing that normalization that I think kind of was accelerated post COVID, of like the ideological alignment of people meeting potentially online first on shared interest, values, whatnot, and then translating those relationships offline. We've seen that in Build. I've made a lot of new great friends that I've seen in several spots around the world now, and I think that prerequisite is absolutely there. Just wanted to just second on that on that point, that I think it makes a lot of sense. And then so build, what is build? So our one liner, and it's gone through a lot of it's gone through the ringer, but it's a protocol for startup cities. So what that basically means is that we're basically building an infrastructure layer for anyone or any community or even group of communities to basically incubate, develop, and kind of scale startup cities around the world. So to put this kind of into context, into what we just released yesterday, which is kind of like our phase one product release, is anybody can log in from any community. So Cabin, CityDAO, whatever. They can basically, they select their top 3 networks. We're calling networks Discord servers because I think they kind of are networks in a way. And then they select their top 3 cities, basically. So the ones that they're probably closest to, whether that be Austin or New York or whatnot. And then we show a map that basically overlays those networks in those existing cities. So you kind of start to get a white pages of, hey, here's all the Cabin DAO folks in New York, and here's all the the Kift folks in San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera. So we have 50 to start, and that's kind of like the foundational layer of what we're looking to do to kind of bridge or form that connective tissue between our our cloud lives or URL or whatever you want to call it with IRL lives. So I think a lot of us are naturally kind of meeting up in person, and this is all the running joke about Web3 being like an events industry and everything. Like, it's because we want that, we want to get to that point, right? Like, we found the ideological alignment. Now let's build stuff. Like, let's build saunas. Like, let's do these things together. And so we're making that tool to kind of accelerate that. Or I mean, that's what exists today as of yesterday, is that tool to kind of start that process. And then, so to kind of go into where we're then going with that, is that as these city directories fill up, so I think New York already has like, I think like 20 or 30 folks. We've already have 200 networks in the product itself. And that was, just the first 72 hours alone. So the idea is that as those city chapters fill up, hey, now we have a group of both, like, you can filter your own community or like explore other ones. And the commonality is that everybody has a Discord or MetaMask implication, being they're in crypto or Web3, and they want to meet each other. And if they're excited about the network state, hey, that's where we can actually activate each city kind of chapter and basically make it its own DAO and bring it on chain, where we can, what we're looking to do is primarily crowd fund ventures and real estate in each one of those city chapters. So that's where we're saying we're kind of basically being an infrastructure layer for existing communities or individuals to start startup cities. And I think Bali, but she mentions like there'll be hundreds of startup cities and probably hundreds of countries, right? There are thousands of them even. So we want to be the infrastructure to kind of make a lot of those.
Yeah, well, and so to that point, like making the infrastructure that startup societies that become network states need, I guess so this is my third like tech organization that I've worked closely with, and all of them, like, there's this very important early stage focus on talking to potential customers or potential users and communities who want to use the product. And like on Balaji has this dashboard that tracks the number of different network states. There's only 26 of those societies on there right now. Like, what makes you confident that you're building the right tools for these organizations? What kind of conversations have you been having with prospective network states? And like at Cabin, we certainly need a directory type tool. Like, I see why that would make sense, but curious, like, how those conversations with prospective startup societies have been going.
Yeah. So, and to kind of be clear, like, I'm using those as references, but like, it doesn't have, like, it can be something like if there's a Discord of, there's a keto example that always goes around, like the keto community. They may not think that they're a startup society, but maybe somebody in there wants to get it going. And so one of the things is like, assume it's 10,000 keto Web3 aficionados. Hey, they can log in, they can use a directory, and they can start to see where their geographical footprint is around the world, and basically accelerate kind of that path to be like, hey, now we have all these folks in New York, like, looks like there's 10 of them, like, let's start doing meetups there. Let's like, we can activate these things a little bit quicker. So I think, this is what I've a lot of the early days of this. It's been about 14 months. We actually did like a whole product cycle where we built a product that allowed you to stake physical real estate as kind of co-working, but we realized that was going to be too transactional and it wasn't getting at the cloud first kind of community thing. So I think a lot of what we've learned from talking to communities and just being in them is really the result of just probably too much time on Discord to kind of see like how these communities communicate online, so that we can basically manifest what they want to do offline, and we meeting points, gatherings, and actually owning physical property together, I think is a great start. So it's our thesis. I mean, it's still a thesis. So I think we'll start to see the results pretty soon. But it's
Sure.
just short answer, just too much time in Discord probably.
Yeah. As I then look to the rest of your roadmap and start to think about like what are the phases that happen later on, I am intrigued because a lot of the things on here, and I'll read them out. So for the audience, there's 4 phases to Build's roadmap. There's phase 1, which is build citizenry, which is what we're in right now. Phase 2 is build assets. Phase 3, build cities. Phase 4, build sovereignty. So I kind of want to go through each one of these, but just to close out phase 1, this sort of like earliest stage, you talk a lot about, or you don't, you have a bullet point here for passport NFTs, and something we've talked about at Cabin and sort of have prioritized and deprioritized and sort of keep playing with. And like, I just personally am interested in passports. Historically, they're many things: a badge, a symbol, a
Yeah.
birthright, a relief, a curse, like it's extreme privilege or it's extreme stress, depending on like sort of the arbitrary birth process of like where you grow up and or where you're born into. And yet like in the like so the League of, I was literally researching this today, but the League of Nations in 1920, so about 100 years ago, basically creates like the first passport standard. Before that, the passport's origin was diplomatic. It was like a written plea, gentleman's agreement between like 2 neighboring countries. And then, now in the last century, it's become this more standardized thing. And you've seen the development of like biometric data and like some passports have like these really cool black light features and holograms. And so you can just see the technology of like passports developing. And of course, like with COVID, I'm sure that there's like a piece to think about like a vaccine passport. So my question for you is like, not even really in the context of Build, but just because I'm going down this passports rabbit hole, like what's the future of passports, and especially as it connects to network states, but also just regular nation states too.
Yeah, that's a great question. As someone who's had my passport stolen in a country on the complete opposite side of the globe, I can definitely relate to everything you just said, and because it was a nightmare trying to get out of that mess. But yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is probably, I mean, what is so if one major aspect of like freedom is mobility, so mobility to move around and kind of be anywhere at any time, and work wherever you want, live wherever you want, marry whoever you want. Like, I think those are all the fundamental kind of, like, if you're viewing it as like a almost like a product for a customer, like those are the things that's like, wow, that's awesome to have. And I know there's the site, I can't remember the name, but it ranks all the passports by amount of mobility that you can basically, or how many other countries you can access.
The passport index, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for getting that out there, because it is cool. So, like, at a functional level, like all those things and any variable or lever that you can influence on any given passport from any, just take existing countries today, like that's huge, like that's super powerful, right? um, and that opens up so many doors for people, for access to opportunities, et cetera, that I think um, um, yeah, I mean, it's weighty, right? So when I think about, I guess, the future of passports, I do kind of think about it as like, hey, like they're like, I definitely think of it as more of like, hey, like the ultimate would be to have passports that allow you freedom of mobility, opportunity, and I guess marriage, or however you want to kind of define those relationships like that, like cross existing borders today. So from a functional standpoint, like I think that's something that I don't think too many people would argue against trying to achieve. Obviously, it'd be great if the more people that have that. I think the better things can be. And then what it looks like, and whether it's like a network state one or a purely digital one. um, I don't have any too many insights on like, yeah, I guess kind of what that looks like, or which kind of underlying nation or network state or whatever, you kind of whatever that future kind of holds. Um, but I think, yeah, I think maximizing freedom of mobility, opportunity, and um, you know, marriage, or whatever the kind of underlying word there is for that,
Mm.
uh, would be a goal that I think we should all strive for.
Great. So as we move from then like things like a passport and other just sort of citizenry infrastructure concepts like the directory that you outlined, and think more about phase 2 of build some roadmap, which is build assets. There are some bullet points on here that I would love like your help understanding sort of the translation from the nation state version to the network state version. So on here you have municipal DeFi, build city grants, build city funds, crypto native municipal bonds, and debt, and build ventures. So like I read that and it seems to me like a lot of different economic backbone type things of a city.
Sure.
Could you just speak to what the function or what will be characteristic of the build assets phase 2?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question, and I know there's kind of a lot on there. They're kind of right now kind of anchor points. Like, some might be crossed off. Like it's a work in progress. We've even had a long conversation today about changing the phase names, but yeah. So phase 2, and this kind of goes back to an earlier question about like, hey, communities. Like, why is this useful for communities? And a big part of what we realized while building this is, hey, like there's infrastructure that we as a distributed team need now in our existing localities that like doesn't exist. And so it just got us thinking, like, we're quite inspired also by like, what Gitcoin grants can do, and the quadratic funding. And so that kind of, we even did a pilot that did a grant for some developers to get solar systems, where they're currently in a country where the electrical grid, like it's on average like 4 hours of electricity per day. And so as a digital economy worker, like they're just trying to access, opportunity, right? And that's a problem that exists in their home today. And yeah, so we ended up, it was enough to buy like 6 systems, and it worked. Like they don't have to pay for he was literally paying for generators, fuel before for their residents, which is common in the country. And now he's got 24/7 access to the internet. He's able to like sharpen his skills, and like we kind of view that, like however small it is today, that's like kind of core infrastructure. So when we think of infrastructure, like that's where we kind of came up with this concept of like, okay, municipal DeFi, like, hey, why can't we be able to crowdfund infrastructure such that maybe it's 6 solar systems today, but maybe it's for a whole, residential block tomorrow, right? Like these things need funds. And I think, if one of the core premises that of kind of the network state, startup cities, whatnot, is that they're built on Web3 rails, then the underlying premise there is also that, like, okay, well, crypto then will be the dominant currency. So by kind of setting up this infrastructure to get in front of those kind of global capital pools, hey, let's reimagine along the way, what could a crypto native municipal bond look like, right? So there's general obligation bonds, which are basically the power of cities to tax to pay for certain things, and then there's things like revenue bonds that might go towards things like toll roads or whatnot that have some kind of recurring revenue stream. So like the Holland Tunnel in New York, $16 every time you go in. I don't know the full history, but I'm pretty sure that was probably like a lot of it financed by revenue bonds. So it's kind of like, hey, let's yeah, I mean, we want to actually crowdfund infrastructure and assets in these cities that can be advantageous to the people on the ground there that live in those cities. And it might not be as complex. It's going to vary city by city. Like everything is kind of digital first, so the only overhead is compute. And along the way, it's like, hey, there's a lot of folks in this given city putting a lot of contributions to the network. It's like, hey, like let's open up some of the let's open up funds to be able to get them what they need to be able to live better lives in their existing cities. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the core focus. I think we're mainly focused on in phase 2 is municipal DeFi. I'll touch on one more thing that I think is really interesting to think about as far as
sure. Well, and just like,
yeah, sure.
But before you do that, like, so for listeners who are maybe less crypto involved, DeFi, decentralized finance, but like where I have a follow up question is just like municipal finance, like,
Yeah.
like I feel like financial terms are intentionally strange and 3 or 4 syllables long to make them harder to understand. Like, what does it mean for something to be municipal finance? And I think that will maybe just connect the dots between your last answer and
Yeah, so I'm still learning myself to be the perfectly vulnerable answer, but on any given city, you can kind of see their budget, right? You can see their budget, you can see what they get from city taxes. So I'm in Jersey. I don't know the exact rate, but like you can kind of see, you at least see the bulk of the funds, like what the total top line amount is on the city budget sheet. And so it's kind of like, hey, like if we're building cities, the core foundation of that is going to be, be able to finance things. So it's kind of like, hey, let's reverse engineer the city budget basically, and build infrastructure that allows more transparent flows of capital through the city to finance the infrastructure that we all need at the end of the day. Sewage, roads, etc. And again, like a lot of those are still lofty ambitions from where we're at, but like it starts small and kind of scales up from there. So hopefully that kind of answered the question. But
it definitely does. And then like, what were you going to say before I interrupted?
yeah, and so just on that point, one thing I think about a lot is like even if people aren't into the network state or startup cities or whatnot, like how can we potentially or even Web3, like abstracting away all these new concepts for any citizen in any city that we all live in. I consider Jersey City home. It's kind of like, hey, what would the what would the what would the what would the difference of feeling be for a citizen of a city if they knew exactly where their tax revenues went, like literally dollar for dollar, which is possible on-chain infrastructure. So imagine at the end of TurboTax or whatever filing you have, you had a list of all the city agencies, and you could put a percent amount in each one that all adds up to 100. You click submit, and you see your city fund allocation go directly to those agencies. And then you could go ahead, if you really wanted to be a sleuth, like go track where those agencies are spending money. And how much more vested of a citizen would you be in that city if you knew where that money was going? Because right now we all pay taxes, it goes into a black box, and that's it. And I think that is actually a really core, like that gets at the problem of where why we're talking about network states and new cities today is like we don't feel a financial connect. We have a major financial disconnect from where a huge chunk of our income goes, and what that seismic shift, like even staying away from like quadratic funding and Harvard, which is all fascinating to consider, but even just the transparency alone and uprooting that, and long way to get to something like that, but like that would make somebody a much more vested citizen, engaged. Probably be interesting to see the correlation on voting turnout and everything like that. So I mean that's cool, right?
I think that's awesome. That's super interesting. And I remember when I graduated from college, my school, like every school does, asks for alumni donations, and you can earmark those donations for certain things. And so I made a small one, but I earmarked it for the gardens because, like, for me, the gardens that we had on campus were some of the like most rewarding parts of my college experience, and like that's
Yeah.
enabled like me to be invested in like that recurring participation with my school, which I'm sure they appreciate, and so I'm sure City would also value that mechanism. And I just, I think about like my dad, who will probably listen to this at some point, and like the city he lives in, and knowing like which parts of that infrastructure he would be most excited for the city to work on, and for him to be able to express that would be like a really exciting component of the just protocolizing a lot of how cities function now, and giving citizens more of a say. So cool.
Yeah.
Appreciate your explanation there. I want to move to phase 3, build cities. So on this, just again for the audience, our bullet points include city governance protocols, IRL pilot of existing city processes on-chain, strategic off-chain and on-chain partnerships, connecting protocol assets together for ease of mobility, explorations of special economic zones and charter city feasibility, launch your own city. So now, I mean, you can really tell that this sort of ambition is escalating. I have just sort of
It
a, I
gets,
mean, you
it
can,
gets, it, go ahead. Sorry.
well, I mean, take sort of this bucket and phase anywhere you want, but I'm kind of curious, like in the same vein of the last part of what we were just saying, like why do city processes need to move on chain, or what kind of partnerships do you anticipate having in this kind of space? I'm
Yeah.
curious how you think about this phase.
Yeah, great question. And full transparency, we realize like how sometimes how it's saying like the roadmap sounds, and we're kind of it gets kind of a little bit I guess kind of foggier the further you go out. But everything we're doing today, so like starting with this product release is like I think a very kind of, we're building a staircase more than like launching, right? Like I think it's a very pragmatic approach. The first one being, hey, let's draw that bridge between URL and IRL lives, and then kind of keep building on that. So, um, uh, short version of that answer is like, subject to change. I should probably put that on the roadmap, but
Well,
so
it's just an excuse for us to talk, right? Like you're
yeah,
not
yeah,
beholden as a
yeah.
company to do exactly what you say in this podcast.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, but so kind of getting back to that, like, I think, you know, uh, so probably uh, I don't know if you've seen the Adrianople Group Startup Cities map. So that's, I think if you just go, I don't know the exact, link, but I think if you Google Startup Cities map and Adrianople, there's a whole list of all the different kind of special economic zones around the world, and really just startup cities in general. So they categorize into three buckets of basically startup cities. So type one being startup cities that attract startups. So like Silicon Valley being an obvious example, but now much more so, Austin, Miami, Coeur d'Alene, more cities around the world, which is great, which is exactly kind of the tailwind of which we're looking to kind of get into. Then there's type two, which are cities that act like startups. They use the examples of like Miami, Dubai, Singapore. That one's, to me sounds kind of like political. So like that one is probably one that we like. I don't think we'll have really control over that. So like that one's kind of like on its own or whatever. And then there's type three, which mentions cul-de-sac and Prospera, where it's cities that basically are startups. So a lot of the stuff we allude to in phase three, and just maybe even a little in phase two, is talking kind of like thinking about these startups, like literal startup cities. Like, hey, like let's put a cul-de-sac neighborhood or a cabin neighborhood like everywhere around the globe. Like let's finance it, let's make it happen, let's build them. But full well realizing that's a long way out.
Sure.
So our core focus right now is mainly on type 1 startup cities, which we view as a prerequisite to type 3, because if you're doing a startup city, you obviously have some entrepreneurial or founder gene, and so you are a founder, and so that area should attract other kind of entrepreneurs and founders. So type 1, we think, is that kind of big umbrella. And there's a great book called Startup Communities by Brad Feld, so one of the co-founders of Techstars. I think a lot of people might be familiar on the show, but it's a great book, and it outlines kind of exactly how he built up Boulder as a startup city, so to speak. And it's very kind of localist focus. It emphasizes I think we're try to be as localist minded as possible. Like, one of the things he mentions is like, hey, to build a startup city, you have to be on a 20-year time horizon, and every day that clock also resets. So it's always kind of a 20-year time horizon. But he talks about how he kind of built Boulder into a startup city, so to speak. And a lot of what we're doing with the product today is basically like looking to productize that approach in cities around the world, which is what Techstars, they had a geographical footprint for the accelerators, around the world, which is, I think, is the major differentiator from something like YC, which was kind of primarily Silicon Valley focused. So I think that's I think putting that at the DNA of what we're doing is pretty important to us, and I think the rest of the vision and foundation, can kind of basically build on that, as long as we're thinking about it that way.
Yeah, it's funny. The core cabin team was just in Denver, and we went to Boulder for a day to sort of strategize for the next season. And I remember thinking, wow, this is like the perfect city for a cabin neighborhood. It's everything.
Yeah.
I have one last main question, and then we'll close out. Rather than put the pressure on you to detail phase 4 sovereignty that's probably years or decades away, I just want to talk about the sovereignty of network states more like broadly, and
sure,
like why. So this is like in reading Balaji's book and thinking a lot about this space. I guess it's just where I need some more clarity as to like, why would a network state want to be sovereign? It seems to me like, that would be a very difficult thing for the rest of the country, where maybe your archipelago of crowdfunded territory is within, to be okay with. Like, what reasons might startup cities or network states want to have for jurisdictional independence, and how might they leverage that? Like, what is afforded to them by such kind of diplomatic recognition?
Yeah. So, and I'll be, I'll be honest here as well. I think that's definitely the one kind of phase, I think, from the book and everything, where it's like it's definitely difficult to develop a lot of conviction around. Like, I don't fully see how it all kind of pans out, but I can understand some of the motivations behind it. So, and I think they're similar, quite similar to the motivation to set up a special economic zone, whether that be, the rights to, innovate in a certain sector, like, medical, or, crypto, like what we're doing in finance, like, to be able to kind of run, those processes at maybe a more a quicker rate. I'm not like, I can see some of the benefits of that, but like the reasons could vary vastly, right? If you look, I think at like Afropolitan, I think, does a phenomenal job kind of articulating the rationale behind an African diaspora like having that kind of sovereignty. And you can, I think you can make the same argument for many diasporas. So I think it probably comes back and loops back around to some of the very first question we brought up in the podcast of like, hey, what is a country? Why do we need new countries? And I think, this is the fascinating kind of R&D of this whole space right now, where we're all still kind of wrestling with these um, questions. But I can see, I think, and tying it back to like the passport one, for example, like the functional benefit to be able to be mobile. Like maybe if you were from a country before where you were on the kind of you were one of the least mobile passports according to that passport index website, and let's say you are able to get into a network state that all of a sudden affords you um, a major amount of freedom of mobility based on you know X, Y, and Z criteria. Like I know we have definitely a lot of visas in all sorts of countries that issue them out for bringing in talent in certain fields and whatnot. So it's kind of like, hey, like that's a functional benefit, and I think you know I think that's probably one of the definitely in the top three of my mind, or for anyone's mind around the world, that would be beneficial to folks, and to kind of achieve sovereignty, so that opportunity is even more equalized, kind of around the world.
Really appreciate that answer and appreciate you coming on the show, Angelo. For listeners who want to learn more about Build, where would you like to direct them to and to what purpose?
Yeah, and again, thanks for having me on. This has been phenomenal, and I look forward to coming down to the property one day. And I have some ideas I need to plant for the cabin community in some Utah properties one day. Where I did a 30-day like survival camp in Utah, which is like really cool setting that I think um, calls to me to go back one day. But I think it'd be awesome for a cabin. But short answer to the question, would love if everybody could check out buildcities.com or buildcities.network. It redirects the same place. You can check out the app today, and it works on desktop only right now, but you'd be able to see exactly kind of what some of the things I was alluding to earlier in the podcast. And yeah, check us out there. Twitter's joinbuild_ is the handle. And but it's all on the website, buildcities.com. So I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you. Can't wait to have you back as you progress through the different phases, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more in the years to come. Cheers.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Take care. See you, Jackson.